On the night, everything should have remained hidden. Someone saw her, and nothing in her world would ever be the same again. Eleanor Ashford felt the weight of humiliation gather around her long before the laughter began. The Harrington Winter Ball glowed with golden chandeliers and polished marble floors, a place where society's brightest paraded their beauty and wealth. But she stood at the edges like a forgotten ornament, trying to blend into the silk-draped walls. Her simple cream gown, altered from a dress worn years before, drew little admiration. Her quiet nature drew even less. Tonight, she hoped only to endure the evening without becoming anyone's cruel entertainment, yet fate had other plans. Lady Pennington, glittering in silver silk and cruelty, spotted her first. "There she is, the perpetual Wallflower," Pennington announced loud enough for surrounding guests to hear. Her companions giggled, delighted by the barb. Eleanor lowered her gaze, not out of surrender but to shield the dignity she still possessed. She reminded herself that silence was safer than confrontation. It had always been her refuge. Still, the mockery pierced deeper than she wished to admit. Then the room changed. A sudden hush swept across the ballroom, as if the very air obeyed an unseen command. Conversation stilled. Fans froze mid-motion. Even the orchestra hesitated. Eleanor lifted her eyes and saw him. Alistair Ravenswood, Duke of Ravenswood, entered with a presence that drew every gaze without effort. Tall, severe, and composed with a cold precision that bordered on inhuman, he was widely known as the coldest duke in England. Rumour claimed he lacked affection, warmth, and anything resembling a heart. Yet at that moment, his gaze swept across the room, paused, and fixed on her with a sharpness that stole her breath. He looked at her as though he were weighing her soul, not her appearance, and society froze in collective disbelief. Whispers surged like a sudden tide. Why is he looking at her? Surely it must be a mistake. The Duke? Interested in a wallflower? Lady Pennington recovered her smirk. "Even the coldest men may glance at something pitiable," she said sweetly, loud enough to wound. Laughter bubbled around them, though it carried far less confidence now. They all sensed the tension. The Duke had not looked away. Eleanor forced herself to stand tall, lifting her chin just slightly, refusing to crumble under their scrutiny. She did not understand why the Duke watched her, nor did she want the attention, but something inside her rose with quiet defiance. She had been mocked many times, yet never before had someone like him stood witness to her shame. And the way he watched her, still, silent, evaluating, sent a tremor through the room that no one dared acknowledge aloud. Alistair Ravenswood's gaze did not soften, but it deepened. The faintest spark ignited in the frozen depths of his expression, as though her endurance revealed something invisible to others, something he recognized, something he could not ignore. And in that single, piercing moment, the night shifted. Mockery faded, whispers grew uncertain, and the first thread of a story neither of them expected quietly took hold. Alistair Ravenswood did not approach her immediately. He remained at the edge of the ballroom like a carved figure of winter stone, observing with the unnerving stillness that had made even the boldest aristocrats step aside in caution. His grey eyes followed Eleanor not with hunger or admiration, but with measured calculation, as though she were a puzzle that demanded solving. He had seen women wilt under mockery, lashing out or bursting into tears, but Eleanor Ashford had simply endured it with a quiet strength that was far rarer than beauty. She did not try to defend herself, nor did she try to flee. She merely stood, wounded but composed, refusing to give her tormentors the satisfaction of seeing her break. It intrigued him far more than he cared to admit. Lord Whitcomb, his oldest confidant, came to his side with an arched brow. "You are studying someone with a great deal of interest, Your Grace." When Alistair did not respond, Whitcomb followed his gaze and nearly choked on his drink. "Miss Eleanor Ashford? Truly, she is hardly the type to capture attention at an event such as this." Alistair's tone remained flat. "Most of society fails to capture my attention, and yet she does," Whitcomb murmured. Alistair ignored the comment, though the truth of it unsettled him. He did not like being unsettled. Across the ballroom, Lady Pennington continued to bask in her temporary victory, still replaying her earlier insult for new listeners. Eleanor had moved toward the refreshment table, hoping to disappear among servants and shadows, but a group of young men sidestepped intentionally to block her path. They laughed as they forced her back with a mock apology. Eleanor murmured a polite excuse and stepped aside, shame flickering briefly across her face. It was that flicker, one she tried desperately to hide, that snapped something inside the Duke. Alistair's jaw tightened. He watched the scene with the cold fury of a man who had spent his life mastering every outward sign of emotion, but who now felt anger bloom in a way he could neither suppress nor ignore. Before Whitcomb could utter another teasing remark, Alistair began to move, his steps deliberate and unhurried, each one cutting through the crowd with effortless authority. Guests parted instinctively. No one wished to impede the Duke of Ravenswood. Eleanor sensed a shift in the room but remained rooted, afraid to meet whatever new wave of humiliation awaited her. When she looked up and saw the Duke advancing toward her, her breath caught painfully. It made no sense. He had no reason to intervene, no reason to acknowledge her at all. Lady Pennington gasped softly, her face paling as she realized the Duke's attention was not accidental, not fleeting, but unmistakably directed. Eleanor tried to step back, but it was too late. The Duke of Ravenswood stopped before her, his presence casting a long shadow across the polished floor. The room waited without breathing. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice low enough to feel intimate, yet strong enough to command the entire ballroom's attention. Her world tilted sharply, and nothing felt safe or predictable, because in that moment, beneath his icy gaze, Eleanor knew her life was no longer hidden in the quiet corners where she once survived. Something had begun, something powerful, frightening, and impossible to ignore. Eleanor could feel the Duke's presence before she fully understood what it meant. The ballroom sank into a tense, breathless quiet, as though a storm cloud had drifted indoors and hovered silently above them. Alistair Ravenswood stood before her with a commanding stillness that made every other figure in the room appear small and insubstantial. She felt her pulse hammer beneath her skin, terrified not of him, but of the attention he carried with him like a second shadow. She was the woman no one noticed, until this moment, when everyone noticed at once. Lady Pennington, regaining a sliver of her confidence, attempted to reclaim control. With a forced smile, she stepped closer, angling her shoulders toward the Duke as though to intercept his focus. "Your Grace," she said with a sugary sweetness, "Miss Ashford was merely in need of a bit of guidance. We were trying to help her." Alistair's gaze slid toward Pennington, and the tiniest flicker of disdain passed through his eyes. It was not dramatic, nor cruel, but it was enough to silence her instantly. He did not bother to offer a response. Ignoring her was far more devastating than any reprimand. Eleanor felt her breath catch again as his attention returned fully to her. There was no warmth in his eyes. There was never warmth in the Duke's eyes, but there was something sharper, more discerning, something that made her feel as though he could see past her exterior to the truth she hid beneath layers of politeness. She attempted a small curtsy, her voice trembling just slightly as she whispered, "Your Grace." To her shock, he answered, with a subtle inclination of his head, a gesture that held unexpected respect. The room hung on every second. Alistair spoke softly, yet his voice carried effortlessly through the silence. "You have been treated poorly," he said. "I find it troubling." Eleanor felt every muscle stiffen in mortification. She shook her head quickly, desperate to minimize the spectacle. "It was nothing of importance, Your Grace, I assure you." The Duke's jaw tightened, and his expression darkened with a kind of cold certainty that made her breath seize. "On the contrary, Miss Ashford," he said, "it was very much of importance." His words fell over the ballroom like shards of ice. A ripple of whispers flared but died under the oppressive weight of his presence. Eleanor could not look at anyone. She feared she might crumble entirely if she saw their shock or disdain. All she could manage was a quiet, trembling breath. The Duke turned his gaze outward then, addressing the members of the ton who had gathered within earshot. "Miss Ashford," he said coolly, "does not require the approval of those who lack her character." The insult, wrapped in flawless aristocratic formality, struck Lady Pennington and her friends harder than any public scolding. Their faces drained of color. No one dared respond. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She had not asked for this, did not want this, but something irreversible had happened. The Duke had defended her, not as a passing gesture, but as a declaration. Whether of principle or something deeper, she could not guess. All she knew was that every rule of her quiet, invisible life had been shattered with a single sentence spoken by the coldest man in England. Eleanor stood frozen, unable to move beneath the crushing weight of 100 eyes. It felt as though the walls of the ballroom had shifted, trapping her in a place where every whisper, every breath, every flicker of judgment pressed against her skin. The Duke's words still echoed in the air, words that defended her more fiercely than she had ever defended herself. She could not understand why he had spoken them. She feared what they would mean, and she knew with painful certainty that nothing about this night would ever return to normal. Lady Pennington attempted to salvage her pride, but her voice wavered. "Your Grace, really, we meant no offense. We were simply concerned." Alistair turned his head just slightly in her direction. The look he gave her, silent, cold, decisive, was enough to stop her words mid-breath. It was the kind of look that destroyed reputations, ended arguments, and silenced rooms. Pennington stepped back as if she had been struck. Her companions followed, their bravado collapsing like brittle glass. Eleanor's heart thudded painfully. She wished she could disappear into the floor, vanish into the crowd, anything to escape the intensity of the moment. The Duke's intervention was not a kindness she had ever imagined receiving. It was terrifying, overwhelming, and impossibly public. She lifted her eyes to him again, trying to find sense in the unreadable mask he wore. "Your Grace," she whispered, "your involvement is not necessary. I do not wish to trouble you." Her words were soft, but firm. She wanted him to understand that she needed no spectacle, no rescue, no force of power sweeping in like a storm she could not control. But Alistair Ravenswood was unmoved. He regarded her with an expression untouched by society's expectations, as though he were evaluating truth rather than propriety. "You do not trouble me," he said quietly, and the simplicity of the statement unsettled her far more than the entire confrontation. His tone held no warmth, only sincerity, sharpened by the gravity for which he was known. Eleanor felt her composure tremble. That a man so distant, so ruthless in his dealings with the world, would speak such a sentence in her defense left her feeling exposed in a way she could not articulate. The tension between them hung thick and fragile. Alistair glanced at the room, displeasure flickering in the slightest hardening around his eyes. "This environment does not suit you," he murmured. "The air is heavy with falsehood." She swallowed, wondering how he could speak so plainly when the entire room listened to every syllable they traded. "I only require a moment," she replied, her voice barely audible. "The terrace will provide enough air." The Duke's jaw tensed, as though he wished to insist on accompanying her, but he inclined his head instead. "As you wish." Eleanor stepped past him, feeling the weight of his gaze lingering on her back long after she left the ballroom. The cold night met her like a blessing, the crisp air clearing her thoughts even as her heart raced uncontrollably. Inside, she knew the ballroom had erupted into speculation. Outside, she pressed a trembling hand to her chest, trying to steady herself against the tide of emotions she could not yet name. And behind her, still in the glow of the chandeliers, the coldest Duke in England remained watching, his expression unreadable, his intentions a mystery, and his interest unmistakably awakened. The terrace welcomed Eleanor with the chill of winter air, sharp enough to steady her trembling breath. She closed her eyes, letting the cold soothe the heat of humiliation and confusion burning beneath her skin. Candlelight spilled faintly through the French doors behind her, casting a soft glow on the stone balustrade. Out here, away from the pressing gazes and poisonous whispers, she could almost believe that she was invisible again, safe in the quiet shadows where society forgot her. But tonight, invisibility had been stolen from her the moment the Duke crossed the ballroom floor. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to gather her scattered composure. The Duke's words replayed again and again, each repetition more bewildering than the last. Why would a man known for emotionless restraint intervene on behalf of a woman society treated as irrelevant? Why risk becoming the subject of gossip himself? She wished he had not spoken. She wished he had not looked at her. She wished she could return to the life where she was simply overlooked, not thrust beneath the unforgiving spotlight of the Duke's attention. And yet, beneath those wishes, another truth pulsed, quiet, fragile, undeniable. A part of her was grateful he had seen what she fought so hard to hide. Footsteps sounded behind her, soft but unmistakable. Eleanor inhaled sharply and turned just as Alistair Ravenswood stepped onto the terrace. He did not announce himself. He simply closed the distance between them with a calm certainty that made her heart pound. Under the moonlight, his presence seemed even more formidable. His shoulders were straight, his expression carved from stillness, but there was something different in his eyes, something she could not decipher. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly, "I trust you are unharmed." The formality of his tone contrasted with the intensity of his concern, creating a tension that tightened her breath. "I am quite well, Your Grace," she replied, though her voice betrayed the tremor she tried to suppress. "I only needed a moment to recover from everything." He studied her in that unnervingly direct way of his, as though searching for the truth she tried to hide. "Your endurance was remarkable," he said. "You showed a level of composure many would envy." Eleanor looked away, heat rising to her cheeks. "I do not endure for admiration," she murmured. "I simply endure." That answer made something shift across his features, subtle but unmistakable, a flash of recognition, perhaps even respect. He stepped closer, far enough that she felt the warmth of him despite the winter air. "You should not suffer such treatment," he said. "Cruelty disguised as civility is still cruelty." Eleanor's breath caught at the softness buried in his words, a softness she doubted the world had ever heard from him. "People will forget tonight soon enough," she whispered. "Mockery fades." The Duke's gaze sharpened. "Mockery fades," he echoed, "but truth does not." For a moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to shrink until it held only the two of them, framed by moonlight and silence. Eleanor lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the strange intimacy of their exchange. "Why did you intervene, Your Grace?" she asked softly. "I am no one of consequence." His answer came after a long, quiet pause. "You are mistaken," he said. "I saw something tonight that others did not." Her heart fluttered in confusion. "What did you see?" The Duke held her gaze, and for the first time, the coldness in his eyes softened. "Strength," he said simply, "and dignity." Before Eleanor could respond, a burst of laughter from inside the ballroom shattered the fragile moment, pulling them back into the world where their connection had no place. But the truth had already been spoken, and it lingered between them like a spark waiting for breath. Eleanor stood in the moonlight, her heart unsteady in her chest, as the Duke's last words settled into the cold night air. Strength, dignity. No one had ever described her with such certainty. Most people barely noticed her existence, and those who did often dismissed her with polite disinterest or cruel amusement. Yet here stood the most intimidating man in England, speaking to her as though she possessed a worth others had overlooked. The realization was dizzying. She felt exposed, not because of the humiliation she had endured inside, but because the Duke saw something in her she had carefully concealed, even from herself. Alistair Ravenswood watched her with a level of attention that might have unsettled another woman, but Eleanor felt something entirely different, a strange, fragile calm. His presence, rather than frightening her, anchored her in a way she could not reason through. He stepped closer, the faintest hint of warmth brushing against her skin as he entered the reach of the terrace lanterns. "I apologize if my intervention drew attention you did not wish for," he said. His voice remained even, but there was a quiet sincerity beneath it. "My intention was not to expose you further." You did not expose me, Your Grace," she replied softly. "The room had already done that long before you stepped in." She attempted a small smile, but it faltered. "I only wish the evening had passed quietly." Alistair's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but contemplation. "You have been taught to hide your strength in order to survive," he said. "That is a tragedy society demands of too many." Eleanor blinked, startled. She had never expected such an observation from him. She had thought him incapable of empathy, let alone insight into her silent battles. Silence stretched between them, long enough for Eleanor to hear her own heartbeat. She felt compelled to speak, though she did not know why. "Your Grace, I fear what your actions will cost you. People will talk." "Let them," he said with quiet finality. "Their opinions have never governed my decisions. They may govern mine," she whispered. "I do not wish to be the subject of gossip, nor the cause of discomfort in your life." The Duke regarded her with an expression that deepened the chill of the night, though she sensed the cold was not aimed at her. "Miss Ashford," he said, "you are not responsible for the discomfort of small minds." Before she could respond, a gust of wind swept across the terrace, lifting a loose tendril of her hair. Without thinking, Alistair reached out, catching the stray curl between his gloved fingers before it could whip into her face. The moment froze, too intimate, too revealing. Eleanor inhaled sharply, eyes widening as his hand hovered near her cheek. The Duke stiffened, realizing the impropriety, and slowly withdrew, though the memory of that fleeting contact lingered in the space between them like a whisper neither dared acknowledge. "You should return inside," he said quietly, his composure restored. "The night grows colder." She nodded, though her pulse still raced. "And you, Your Grace?" He paused, and his gaze softened, just slightly. "I will follow shortly." Eleanor offered a faint curtsy before slipping back into the ballroom, the warmth of the candles contrasting sharply with the cold imprint of the Duke's touch on her skin. Inside, the murmurs resumed, but Eleanor no longer felt quite as small, nor quite as invisible. Something had shifted, within her, and between them, and she knew, with a trembling certainty, that this shift would not go unnoticed by the world. Eleanor re-entered the ballroom with her composure restored only in fragments. She attempted to slip back into the shadows, but the moment her slippers touched the polished floor, she felt the shift in the room. Dozens of eyes lifted toward her, not with kindness nor with curiosity, but with sharp, assessing interest. Conversations faltered, whispers ignited. The terrace doors had barely closed behind her when a wave of speculation swept through the gathered guests. It was as though every noble family had suddenly discovered that the quiet wallflower they mocked moments ago had become the center of a story far more compelling than any dance or flirtation the evening had promised. Lady Harrington's fan snapped open with sudden enthusiasm as she leaned toward her companions. "It is true, then," she whispered loudly enough to be heard. The Duke spoke to her alone. Another woman gasped softly. "Do you think he intends to make her his charity case? A small act of kindness for the unfortunate?" "No, act from a man like him is small," someone else replied, "and certainly not charity." The low hum of gossip intensified, swirling through the room like smoke. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment this time, but from the realization that her life was being rewritten by mouths that knew nothing of her. She willed her breathing to remain steady. She told herself that they would grow bored soon enough, that the Duke's brief involvement would be seen as a momentary curiosity. She prayed she could fade again into the comfortable obscurity she had always known. But deep down, beneath layers of practiced detachment, she sensed that obscurity would no longer be permitted to her. Across the room, the Duke reappeared, stepping through the crowd with a measured calm that parted guests like water around a stone. His presence was commanding without effort, and even though he made no move toward her, the mere fact that he existed in the same space as she created a tension that everyone felt profoundly. Eleanor lowered her gaze, trying not to draw further attention, but the damage had already been done. She overheard a young lord murmur, "The cold Duke has thawed for a wallflower." "Impossible," another replied. "If he has, then she must possess something none of us recognized." "And that itself, and that id way." Her mother appeared at her side, breathless with concern. "Eleanor, what happened? People are talking. They say the Duke defended you. They say he followed you outside." Her mother's hands fluttered nervously, adjusting Eleanor's gown, though nothing was out of place. "This could bring either fortune or ruin, but I fear it will be the latter if we do not tread carefully." Eleanor wished she could reassure her, but she barely understood the evening herself. Meanwhile, Alistair Ravenswood watched the room from a distance, analyzing every reaction with the same precision he applied to negotiations. He noted who whispered with malice, who watched Eleanor with resentment, and who began re-evaluating her entirely. Society shifted like a living creature, always hungry, always cruel. He hated how they fed on her pain. But he also understood something else. His attention had changed the balance, and he would not allow them to destroy her for it. Eleanor did not yet know it, but the Duke of Ravenswood had just made a silent decision. He would not stand aside again. Alistair Ravenswood remained near the edge of the ballroom, outwardly composed, yet inwardly brimming with an unfamiliar turbulence. He had always prided himself on a mind as sharp as any blade, a will unbending to distraction or sentiment. But tonight, something was undeniably wrong, because Eleanor Ashford, a woman he had not known an hour before, occupied his thoughts with a persistence that unsettled him. He tried to redirect his attention to the political associates who approached him, offering predictable greetings layered with subtle probing. Yet he dismissed them quickly, uninterested in their ambitions. His focus kept drifting toward the quiet figure standing half-hidden near a column, her hands clasped gently before her as she endured another barrage of curious glances. She was not flirting, not posturing, not even trying to defend herself from the spreading gossip. She simply stood with quiet grace, refusing to be diminished, and that, for reasons he could not articulate, struck him more deeply than any beauty or charm within the room. Eleanor felt the Duke's gaze, even when she could not see it. She tried to remain still and unobtrusive, but her thoughts fluttered uncontrollably. She had spent her life moving softly through society, careful not to draw attention, careful not to invite judgment. Tonight, that effort had failed catastrophically. Every whisper felt like a knife. She reminded herself to breathe, to remain calm, to carry dignity even under scrutiny. But her mind raced with questions she dared not ask aloud. Why had he intervened? What had he seen in her? Why could she still feel the weight of his presence like a heartbeat that did not belong to her? Lady Cassandra, accompanied by 2 admirers, glided past Eleanor with a disdainful snort. It is astonishing how a single moment can give the most ordinary girl delusions of importance, she muttered. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, wishing the Duke had not witnessed her humiliation, wishing even more that the world would stop tearing her apart to satisfy its hunger for spectacle. But when she opened her eyes again, she found the Duke's gaze fixed on her once more, sharp, steady, impossible to ignore. Alistair's emotions churned in ways he could not accept. He had intervened because cruelty offended him, he told himself, because weakness, disguised as social amusement, disgusted him, because Pennington and her ilk represented everything hollow and corrupt within the world he despised. But that was not the entire truth, and he knew it. Eleanor's quiet endurance had drawn him in. Her refusal to retaliate had impressed him, and her presence, gentle, unassuming, yet strangely resolute, had pierced the cool armor he had worn for far too long. He hated the vulnerability that stirred inside him, yet he could not walk away from it. Whitcomb approached him again, curiosity plain on his face. "You have not taken your eyes off her," he murmured. "Are you certain you wish to invite such chaos?" Alistair did not answer. The question lingered, but the answer had already formed, in the stillness of his mind. Chaos had already come, and he no longer possessed the desire to resist it. Eleanor finally dared to glance his way, and when their eyes met, something silent and powerful passed between them. It was not romance, not yet. It was recognition, a spark of truth that neither of them fully understood, but both instinctively felt. In that moment, while the rest of the ballroom gossiped and speculated, a connection formed that would soon pull them into a world neither of them could have anticipated. Eleanor remained near the column, wishing with every heartbeat that invisibility would return to her. Yet the eyes of the ballroom followed her like moths drawn to an unfamiliar light, some curious, some envious, some openly hostile. She hated being observed, hated the weight of gossip swirling around her like a tightening corset. She would have given anything to sink into the shadows again, to let the world forget she existed. But the Duke's intervention had cast an unforgiving spotlight over everything she did, every breath she took. The more she tried to be small, the larger she seemed to grow in their eyes. A servant approached timidly, carrying a tray of refreshments. When Eleanor reached for a glass, her hand trembled, making the crystal clink softly against the silver tray. The servant looked at her with gentle pity, a look she could bear far more easily than mockery. "Thank you," she whispered, grateful for the simple human kindness. But the moment she tried to step away, 2 ladies brushed past her with exaggerated disdain, loudly discussing how some women seek attention in the most shameless ways. Eleanor swallowed her hurt and kept moving. She would not break, not here, not in front of them. Meanwhile, Alistair Ravenswood continued to observe her, though he deliberately kept his distance. He understood that approaching her again would set the ballroom ablaze with fresh scandal. He also knew Eleanor needed space. Her expression made that painfully clear. But giving her distance did not mean his protective instincts had weakened. If anything, they sharpened with every slight he witnessed. He watched as she navigated the crowd with quiet politeness, never retaliating, never allowing bitterness to stain her dignity. That restraint struck him harder than any bold declaration ever could. It was the kind of strength he had always believed to be rare, perhaps even non-existent, among society's polished facades. Lord Whitcomb joined him once more. "You are losing your battle with indifference," he murmured. "She is affecting you." Alistair's jaw tightened. "She is being tormented," he replied. "And I find the behavior of this room intolerable." Whitcomb studied him for a long moment. "You mean you find it intolerable when directed at her?" Alistair did not answer. He did not need to. The truth lived in the lines of his face, in the tension coiled beneath his stillness, in the way his gaze followed only one woman. Eleanor attempted to retreat toward a quieter corner, but a group of young men blocked her path once again. Their smiles were polite, but their intent was not. "Miss Ashford," one drawled, "perhaps you would honor us with a dance? After all, you seem to have captured quite an unexpected interest tonight." The innuendo was clear, and Eleanor felt heat rush to her cheeks. She opened her mouth to decline with grace, but her voice faltered. The men exchanged smirks, satisfied with her discomfort. Before she could muster a response, a sudden shift in the room's energy pulled their attention elsewhere. The Duke was moving. His steps were slow but unmistakably deliberate, like the tightening of a snare. The young men paled, stumbling aside before he had even reached them. Alistair did not speak to them. He simply looked, and his cold, unwavering stare was enough to dismantle their arrogance entirely. Eleanor froze as he stopped mere feet away, his presence wrapping around her like a protective shield she had not asked for but silently needed. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly, "you seem unwell. Fresh air may serve you." She nodded, unable to argue. He did not touch her, did not offer his arm, but he created a path for her with the sheer force of his presence. Every step she took felt like stepping deeper into a world that was shifting beneath her feet, a world where the coldest man in England had chosen to stand beside her, whether the world accepted it or not. The cool night air greeted Eleanor far more gently the second time she stepped onto the terrace, though her nerves remained taut beneath her skin. She had not realized how desperately she needed to escape the suffocating pressure of the ballroom until the doors closed behind her and muted the swell of whispers. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, grateful for even a moment of solitude. But unlike before, solitude did not last long, because Alistair Ravenswood followed her, not with haste, but with an unmistakable sense of purpose. His presence filled the quiet space in a way that felt impossible to ignore. Eleanor turned toward him, unsure whether to curtsy or apologize, or simply vanish into the stone railing. But the Duke stopped a respectful distance away, his posture controlled, his breath forming soft clouds in the cold. "I am aware," he said calmly, "that my actions this evening have drawn unwanted attention to you." She blinked, startled not by his words, but by the emotion, subtle, restrained, but undeniably present, threading through his voice. "I only meant to intervene when the mockery became intolerable." Eleanor's heart tightened. I appreciate your intention, Your Grace," she murmured, "but I fear the consequences may be far greater than either of us anticipated. Even soll nating business vierlandet in the proof found, hos alon sterius vierlande bound, who was naughty to bees." The Duke's expression did not waver, but something shifted in the tension around his eyes. "Consequences matter little to me." There was no arrogance in his tone, only certainty. "I act as I choose." She looked at him, unsteady. "Even when your choice affects someone who cannot bear the weight of your reputation." His brow lifted almost imperceptibly. "You speak as though my involvement is a burden." Eleanor hesitated. "Is it not? Everyone is watching. Everyone is talking. They will not forget tonight, Your Grace. And I am not accustomed to being the center of anything." That admission, spoken quietly and without bitterness, settled between them like a fragile truth. Something in Alistair's expression softened ever so slightly, though his voice retained its calm precision. "You do not seek attention, that is evident, but attention found you regardless. The fault lies not with you." His words were steady, but Eleanor sensed the unspoken meaning beneath them. To the Duke, fault lay with those who preyed on the vulnerable, not with the vulnerable themselves. It was a worldview she had never expected from a man feared for his coldness. She wrapped her arms around herself against the winter chill. "You speak as though I am stronger than I feel." "Ah, you are," he replied with quiet conviction. "Strength is not loud, Miss Ashford, nor is it showy. The strongest souls are often those who endure what others would crumble beneath." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever described her with such respect. No one had ever looked at her and seen something deeper than silence. For a moment, neither moved. The night wrapped around them, the cold forgotten beneath the weight of his words. Eleanor felt warmth flicker beneath her ribs, not romantic, not dangerous, yet, but deeply human. The Duke watched her as though learning the contours of a truth he had long overlooked in others, and Eleanor, against all instinct, realized that she did not want him to walk away. But footsteps sounded behind them, someone approaching the terrace. The fragile moment shattered. The Duke's expression cooled instantly, returning to the stoic armor the world expected of him. Eleanor stepped back, bracing herself for yet another wave of scrutiny, and Alistair Ravenswood, whose heart had remained locked for years, felt a sharp irritation at the intrusion, because for the first time he had not wanted to be interrupted. Eleanor barely had time to gather herself before the terrace door opened fully, spilling warm light across the stone floor. Her mother stepped out, her expression strained with equal parts concern and frantic calculation. "There you are," Mrs. Ashford whispered sharply, her eyes darting between her daughter and the Duke. "People are wondering where you have gone, Eleanor. You must not give them reason to speak further." Her mother's voice trembled, not with anger but with fear, the kind of fear born from years of navigating society's cruel unpredictability. Alistair inclined his head to her with polite formality. "Mrs. Ashford." The older woman immediately dipped into a deep curtsy, her nerves obvious. "Your Grace, I did not realize Eleanor had found herself in your company again. I hope she has not imposed." Eleanor felt a pang of embarrassment at her mother's apologetic tone. Before she could protest, the Duke answered in a calm voice that carried quiet authority. "Miss Ashford imposes nothing." That simple sentence, delivered with his controlled confidence, rendered Mrs. Ashford speechless. Realizing the impossibility of remaining on the terrace without drawing even more attention, Eleanor offered a small, respectful nod. Perhaps we should rejoin the gathering. She hoped the Duke might choose to remain behind, allowing her a moment to slip unnoticed back into the ballroom. But Alistair stepped forward slightly, aligning his pace with hers as though escorting her, even though he did not take her arm. The act was subtle, careful, yet unmistakably protective. It sent a fresh wave of whispers through the ballroom the moment they re-entered. Guests turned, heads inclining, eyes widening. The combined reaction rolled through the crowd like a gust of wind. Some expressions were curious, others scandalized. A few wore envy sharp enough to cut. Eleanor felt her pulse climb, each stare pressed against her like a weight she could not shrug off. She longed to flee, yet she walked steady at the Duke's side, because to falter now would only feed the growing storm of gossip. Lady Cassandra stood near the center of the room, frozen mid-conversation. Her painted smile cracked the instant she saw Eleanor return under the Duke's silent escort. She recovered quickly, lifting her chin with false bravado. My, she said to the ladies beside her. "It seems our little Wallflower has found herself a frostbitten guardian. How charming." Her companions tittered, though none dared speak loudly enough for the Duke to hear. But Cassandra's eyes glittered with resentment, a warning Eleanor felt in her bones. Eleanor's mother guided her to a quieter corner, fussing with her hair and smoothing imaginary wrinkles. "You must be polite, you must smile, and above all, you must not be alone with him again tonight," she whispered urgently. "People will think he is courting you." Eleanor's breath hitched. "That is impossible," she whispered. "He barely knows me. He would never." But her voice faded when she looked up and found Alistair Ravenswood still watching her, his expression unreadable, yet unmistakably attentive. Her mother followed her gaze and paled. Eleanor felt the room tilt again, the Duke's presence reshaping her fate in ways she could neither predict nor prevent. And though she told herself it was nothing, simply a moment of misfortune that would soon fade, a quiet truth began to settle in her chest. She was no longer a wallflower. She had become the subject of the coldest man in England's attention, and the world would not look away. Eleanor did everything in her power to retreat into the edges of the gathering, but the ballroom refused to return her to anonymity. Every turn she made, every slow step she took, was watched, observed by curious eyes, recorded by eager gossipers, and interpreted by people who had never cared to notice her before. She stood near a tall window draped in velvet, her fingers lightly grazing the cold glass as though the night beyond offered an escape. Yet even the darkness outside could not quiet the storm brewing inside her. She wanted to breathe. She wanted to think. She wanted, desperately, to reclaim the stillness she had once felt on the terrace before the Duke appeared. But she could not unfeel the way he had looked at her, nor erase the sound of his voice when he defended her dignity as if it mattered to him. That, more than the whispers, rattled her to her core. Across the room, Alistair Ravenswood remained in conversation with a small cluster of noblemen. His posture was impeccable, his expression carved from composed indifference, but Eleanor sensed, without knowing how, that the exchange was merely a formality. His attention was not on them. Even from the distance between them, she felt the subtle weight of his gaze drift toward her, measuring, evaluating, thinking. The sensation prickled against her skin, not unpleasant, but deeply unnerving. She had never been studied like this. She doubted any woman in England had ever been studied like this. Lady Cassandra seized the moment. She approached Eleanor with the elegance of a predator pretending to be a friend, her lips curving into a smile that held no warmth. "My dear Miss Ashford," she said softly, though her tone carried a gleaming edge, "I fear you may have found yourself in a rather delicate position this evening." Eleanor turned to her, keeping her back straight and her voice steady. "I am not certain what you mean, Lady Cassandra." Cassandra laughed lightly. "Oh, come now. You cannot be so naive. The Duke's actions have placed you in the center of a gossip storm. I would be quite frightened were I you." Eleanor swallowed, willing herself not to react. Cassandra moved closer, lowering her voice. "Men like him do not choose women like you, not for anything meaningful. You will find that out soon enough." Eleanor felt the words sink like stones into her stomach. She opened her mouth to respond, to defend herself, not from the insult, but from the insinuation that the Duke's interest, whatever it was, had no depth. But before she could speak, Cassandra's expression flickered. She looked past Eleanor, her eyes widening faintly. Eleanor turned slowly. The Duke was approaching. He did not acknowledge Cassandra. He did not greet her. He walked past her as though she were no more than a shadow on the floor. His attention rested solely on Eleanor. "Miss Ashford," he said in that calm, cutting voice of his, "the air indoors appears heavy. If you require a reprieve, I can arrange a quieter space for you." Cassandra stiffened, the rejection slicing through her composure. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, the offer too kind, too public, too impossible. "Your Grace," she whispered, "I am managing, truly." Alistair studied her a moment longer, as though testing the truth of her words. When he finally nodded, his gaze slipped briefly toward Cassandra, who blanched under the coldness she found there. With a final, silent glance at Eleanor, the Duke returned to his perimeter, yet his presence lingered, a protective radius only she seemed to occupy. Eleanor exhaled shakily. She had come to this ball as a woman the world overlooked. Tonight, she felt impossibly, terrifyingly seen. Eleanor tried to steady her breathing, but her composure wavered as Lady Cassandra lingered at her side, the false sweetness gone from her expression. The Duke's interruption had not just embarrassed Cassandra, it had wounded her pride in a way she could not easily forgive. The anger simmering beneath her flawless exterior was unmistakable. "Do you see now?" Cassandra murmured with a brittle smile. "What happens when you place yourself where you do not belong?" Eleanor stiffened. "I did no such thing. I simply stood where anyone might stand." Cassandra's eyes glittered. "And yet he came to you, twice. Tell me, Miss Ashford, what exactly did you say or do to earn such attention?" Eleanor recoiled at the implication. "I did nothing." "Precisely," Cassandra replied sharply. "Nothing. And that is what you will be left with when this spectacle ends." Her words struck with surgical cruelty, and before Eleanor could craft any response, Cassandra leaned closer. "Men like the Duke do not choose quiet, forgettable women. They might offer pity, they might offer a moment's curiosity, but affection?" Cassandra's eyebrow arched with a slow, disdainful sweep. "Never. You would be wise to remember your place before someone reminds you far less gently." Eleanor felt the sting of the insult, though she fought to keep it off her face. She drew a quiet breath. "Perhaps," she said softly, "our places are not for others to decide." Cassandra's lips parted in disbelief, but she recovered quickly, her smile hardening. "We shall see." With that, she swept away, her gown whispering against the marble floor like a threat disguised as silk. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength, but the encounter had shaken her confidence more deeply than she wished to admit. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned toward the refreshment table, hoping for a moment's reprieve. But movement in the corner of her vision made her pause. The Duke was watching, not openly, not indulgently, just a subtle tilt of his head as he observed Cassandra's retreat and Eleanor's unsettled posture. There was something in his expression that startled her, not curiosity, not judgment, but displeasure. Quiet, controlled, unmistakable displeasure at what he had witnessed. He did not cross the room this time. He merely redirected the slightest fraction of his attention toward the men beside him, signaling that he had seen enough to form an opinion. And that opinion, judging by the tension across his jaw, did not favor Lady Cassandra. Eleanor felt a flicker of something fragile, gratitude perhaps, or comfort, before she forced herself to look away. She could not depend on the Duke's presence. She must remain composed. A butler passed by offering champagne. Eleanor reached for a glass, needing the distraction, but her hand betrayed her, trembling just slightly. Before she could grasp the stem, a gloved hand reached past her and steadied the glass for her. She startled, nearly gasping, until she turned and found herself face to face with him. Alistair Ravenswood stood closer than propriety allowed, his presence enveloping her in quiet authority. "Your hand shakes," he observed, his voice low, intended only for her. "You are distressed." Eleanor tried to smile. "It has been an overwhelming evening, Your Grace." His gaze held hers for a long, searching moment. "People like Lady Cassandra," he said with precise calm, "thrive on their ability to wound those they envy. Headed were life to worken by the lot so from the months." Eleanor blinked. "Envy?" The word sounded absurd, but the Duke did not blink. "Yes, envy. Do not mistake malice for superiority, Miss Ashford." Her breath caught in her throat. Before she could respond, another guest approached, and Alistair stepped back, reclaiming the distance demanded by decorum. Yet the echo of his words remained, stronger than Cassandra's cruelty, stronger than Eleanor's doubts. She had never believed herself worthy of envy, but the Duke of Ravenswood had. For several moments after the Duke stepped away, Eleanor remained rooted in place, her fingers curled lightly around the glass he had steadied for her. His words lingered with a quiet, bewildering power. Envy. The idea felt almost laughable. Lady Cassandra, beautiful, confident, admired, envying her? It was unthinkable. Yet the Duke had spoken with such calm certainty that the notion clung to Eleanor's thoughts like a stubborn flame. She set the untouched glass aside and smoothed the front of her gown, willing her heart to settle. But the air in the ballroom had grown too thick with speculation, and she sensed that remaining still would only invite more stares. She moved toward a less crowded corner, though even there, conversations dimmed as she passed. She tried to ignore it, tried to breathe evenly, tried to steady herself. And then, suddenly, a gloved hand extended toward her, firm, poised, unmistakably intentional. Eleanor looked up, startled to find the Duke standing before her once again, his demeanor perfectly controlled, though his eyes held an intensity that stirred something deep within her chest. "Walk with me," he said quietly. Not a command, but an invitation, one spoken softly enough to offer her the dignity of refusal, while still carrying the weight of a man unaccustomed to being refused. Eleanor hesitated, her pulse fluttering. She knew that accepting would cause another storm of whispers. She knew that walking with him would signal a familiarity she did not possess and a claim she did not understand. But something in his expression, something subtle and unguarded, overruled her fear. She placed her hand lightly on his arm. The room inhaled as one. Together, they stepped through the crowd, the Duke's presence clearing a path without a word. Guests parted instinctively, some in awe, others in shock, a few in barely concealed outrage. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm under the collective scrutiny, but the Duke walked with such steady assurance that her own steps grew smoother in response. She did not look around. She did not dare. Instead, she focused on the warmth beneath her fingertips, where her hand rested on his sleeve. They exited the ballroom through a side corridor, the soft glow of wall sconces guiding them deeper into the manor. Eleanor's nerves eased just slightly once they were away from the public eye. The silence between them stretched, but it held none of the discomfort she expected. It was peaceful, weighted, intentional. Alistair's voice broke the quiet at last. "You have shown remarkable composure tonight." Eleanor blinked, uncertain how to respond. "I fear I have shown nothing remarkable at all, Your Grace. I have simply endured what I could not escape." He turned his head toward her, and in the golden light of the corridor, she saw something new in his expression, something softer than she had ever imagined possible. "Endurance," he said, "is the rarest form of strength. Society mistakes silence for meekness. They do not understand the power in restraint." His words wrapped around her with a warmth she had not known she needed. "You see too much," she whispered, "or perhaps others see too little," he replied. They reached a door that opened into the estate gardens. Winter flowers glowed faintly beneath the moonlight, their silhouettes delicate and sharp. The Duke paused, gesturing for her to step outside first. She did, and as they walked into the quiet cold together, only one truth settled clearly in Eleanor's mind. Whatever was forming between them, it would not be small, it would not be simple, and it would not fade. The night air in the estate gardens wrapped around them with a crisp stillness, the kind that made every sound feel sharper and every breath more deliberate. Frost clung to the trimmed hedges like delicate lace, and the moonlight painted silver edges onto every leaf and stone. Eleanor took a slow breath, feeling the cold settle into her lungs in a way that steadied her more effectively than any whispered reassurance. She walked beside the Duke, unsure where to begin, unsure whether she should speak at all. Yet the silence between them was not heavy. It felt intentional, as though words would have only diluted the truth pulsing quietly in the space they shared. Alistair Ravenswood walked with a measured stride, his hands clasped behind him, his coat brushing against the gravel path with each step. Even in the faint glow of the lanterns, his posture remained perfect, every line of him composed, precise, as if carved into the night. But something about him seemed less rigid now, softened by their distance from the ballroom and the suffocating eyes within it. When he finally spoke, his voice blended with the quiet rustle of winter branches. "When I was younger," he began, "my father would bring me to this garden to remind me of the value of restraint. He believed that a man who mastered his impulses could master his world." Eleanor listened, surprised by the personal nature of the admission. "And did you believe him?" she asked softly. Alistair considered her question for a moment before answering. "I believed that feelings, especially vulnerable ones, could be used as weapons against me. In that sense, restraint became necessity." Eleanor felt a pang in her chest. She had always believed nobility lived free from the wounds ordinary people carried, but in his voice she heard something raw, something that made him suddenly, startlingly human. "That must have been difficult," she said. He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze lingering on her face with a depth that nearly stole her breath. "It taught me to be careful," he said, "perhaps too careful." They continued along the path, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet punctuating the stillness. Eleanor found herself speaking without fully intending to. "I have spent so much of my life trying not to be noticed, trying to avoid giving anyone reason to ridicule me. It is easier to be small, sometimes." Her voice wavered, but she did not look away. Alistair stopped walking. "You believe hiding yourself is safety," he said, "but invisibility becomes a prison when it is forced upon you." She felt her eyes sting with unexpected emotion. "Then what am I to do? Step into the light and invite more cruelty?" "No," he said firmly. "Step into the light because they do not decide who you are, and because you deserve to be seen." Eleanor's breath trembled, not from the cold but from the weight of a truth she had never dared to speak aloud. No one had ever told her she deserved to be seen, not as an object of ridicule, not as an inconvenience, but as a person of value. Yet this man, carved from frost and guarded by an armor of emotional distance, spoke it as though it were the simplest fact in the world. They walked again, slower this time. Eleanor felt the frost glow under her feet, the night hum with a new, fragile electricity. When they reached the end of the path, she turned toward him, unsure what to say, unsure what he expected. But Alistair merely inclined his head, his voice soft yet unwavering. "Miss Ashford, you showed courage tonight, more than anyone else in that room." And though she did not fully believe it yet, she realized something life-altering in that moment. She wished the night would not end, and she wished the Duke would not stop looking at her the way he did now. The following morning, London awoke already hungry for scandal. It was remarkable how swiftly the whispers from the Harrington Winter Ball had spread, faster than horse-drawn carriages, faster than ink on the daily broadsheets. News of the Duke of Ravenswood's unexpected interest in Eleanor Ashford travelled through maidservants, footmen, bakers, booksellers, and every household with even a passing ear for gossip. By midday, half the city spoke her name with fascination. By afternoon, the other half spoke it with disdain. Eleanor, unaware of the storm she had inadvertently ignited, sat at her family's modest breakfast table, turning a porcelain cup in her hands while her mother paced behind her. "Eleanor, you do not understand," Mrs. Ashford fretted, wringing her hands as she moved from window to window. "These whispers, they're everywhere. Mrs. Dunwell wrote at dawn to inform me that every guest at the ball has already told a different version of what happened. Some say the Duke was irate with Lady Pennington. Others insist he followed you onto the terrace to declare something. And now," she pressed a hand dramatically to her chest, "now they are speculating that he intends to pursue you." Eleanor nearly dropped her cup. "That is absurd," she protested softly. "He was simply being civil in the face of cruelty, nothing more." Her mother spun toward her. "Civil?" she repeated. "Men like the Duke do not act out of civility. Everything they do is interpreted as intention, and intention is dangerous." Eleanor lowered her gaze to the swirling tea, her pulse quickening as memories of the previous night drifted back. His steady voice, his piercing gaze, the subtle warmth beneath his controlled exterior. She tried to force the images away, but they clung stubbornly. "Mother," she said quietly, "the Duke does not know me. Whatever people are saying is nonsense." "Mrs." Ashford sighed heavily, sitting across from her with trembling hands. "I want to believe that, but every rumor, every single one, centers on you. And now there are concerns that people will think you sought his attention." The thought made Eleanor's stomach twist. "I did nothing of the sort." "Of course you did not," her mother said quickly. "But society rarely cares for truth. It cares only for stories." She reached across the table, taking Eleanor's hands in her own. "I fear this will place a strain on you that you are not prepared for." At that very moment, in a grand townhouse across the city, Alistair Ravenswood stood rigid in his study, while Lord Whitcomb read aloud the morning's most inflammatory gossip column. "A surprising turn occurred last night at the Harrington Ball," Whitcomb recited dramatically. "The Duke of Ravenswood, known for his icy reserve and disdain for courtship, was seen not once, but multiple times in the company of Miss Eleanor Ashford, a young woman of modest standing. Observers claim the Duke appeared unusually attentive, even protective." Alistair's jaw tightened with each word. "Enough," he said sharply. Whitcomb lowered the paper but did not hide his intrigued smirk. "It seems your actions have sparked the imagination of every gossip-monger in London." Alistair did not respond immediately. A part of him wanted to dismiss the rumors with cold disinterest. Another part, one he did not welcome, felt something dangerously close to concern. His steel-grey gaze shifted to the window, where the winter sun glinted off the frosted rooftops. "They twist the truth," he said at last. Whitcomb exhaled softly. "They do. That is what gossip does. The question, Alistair, is whether you intend to ignore it. Innova caught him from septing, and what did not?" The Duke remained silent, tension coiling through him with quiet ferocity. He did not understand this pull toward Eleanor Ashford, not yet, but he knew one thing with startling clarity. Ignoring the world's gossip would be far easier than ignoring her. Eleanor spent most of the morning moving through her home like a woman half awake, as though her thoughts had wandered somewhere far beyond the modest walls of the Ashford townhouse. She tried to resume her usual tasks, reading by the parlor window, helping her mother arrange correspondence, assisting the maid with household organization, but nothing held her attention. Every now and then, memories from the previous night flickered back with startling clarity. The Duke's steady voice, the rare softness in his expression, the shocking certainty with which he had defended her. She pressed her fingers to her temple, reprimanding herself for dwelling on a man whose life was so distant from her own that their worlds should never have collided. Yet they had, and the collision had left her shaken in a way she could no longer deny. Her mother entered the parlor carrying a small stack of letters, her expression troubled. 2 invitations were withdrawn this morning, she said quietly, placing the envelopes on the table. Lady Harrington sent a polite but unmistakably cold note, and the Fairbankses claimed they must postpone their dinner indefinitely. Eleanor felt a familiar tightness coil around her ribs. Because of the gossip? Because they fear association, her mother replied. Some believe the Duke might have taken an interest in you. Others believe you have placed yourself in his path. Eleanor shook her head quickly. Mother, please, you know I did no such thing. I do, her mother said gently, but truth matters little when gossip takes the lead. Eleanor looked toward the window, watching a thin layer of frost melt along the glass. She felt as though she were dissolving into something she did not recognize, a woman whose future hung precariously on rumors that had nothing to do with her actions. Perhaps, she whispered, this will pass. Her mother hesitated before responding. It will pass only if the Duke allows it to. That is the truth of society, Eleanor. His silence, whether intended or not, will determine how the story is told. Eleanor's heart sank. She had not expected the Duke to come to her defense further. She barely understood why he had defended her once, but the thought of relying on his choices unsettled her deeply. Across the city, Alistair Ravenswood stood alone in his private study, staring at the remnants of Whitcomb's discarded newspaper. He had dismissed the discussion abruptly, but the words from the column lingered with a persistence he found intolerable, unusually attentive, protective. The speculation was infuriating, not because the public watched him, they always watched him, but because they spoke of Eleanor with a casual cruelty that twisted something uncomfortably tight within him. He refused to give weight to feelings he did not fully comprehend, yet the truth was undeniable. He did not like seeing her name stained by the tongues of fools. But another truth, quieter and far more dangerous, troubled him more. He had not written to her, had not sent word, had not made any move at all. He told himself it was for her sake, that his silence would quell the rumors instead of inflaming them. But the hours ticked by, and that reasoning felt increasingly hollow. The silence grew heavier, more pointed, until even he recognized it for what it was, avoidance. Whitcomb entered without knocking, as only he dared. Still brooding? He asked lightly. Alistair shot him a cold look, but Whitcomb merely closed the door and approached the desk. You know, he said slowly, if you do nothing, the world will decide the story for you, and it will not be kind to her. The Duke's jaw clenched. The idea of Eleanor suffering in silence, blamed for actions that were entirely his, struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. After a long moment, Alistair spoke, his voice low, almost unwilling. I needed time to consider. Whitcomb raised a brow. And have you? The Duke turned toward the window, where winter light cast sharp edges across the room. No, he admitted, but I know I cannot remain silent much longer. And for the first time, he felt the cost of restraint. The day stretched painfully for Eleanor, each hour bringing a new wave of whispers and cold glances from those who once considered her too insignificant to acknowledge. By afternoon, even the servants walked with a certain tension, as though afraid to speak aloud the scandal threading its way through London. Eleanor attempted to remain composed, but the constant hum of gossip wore at her spirit, fraying the quiet dignity she clung to. When her mother suggested she take tea in the sitting room to calm her nerves, Eleanor agreed only to escape the oppressive silence that had settled between them. But before she could reach for her teacup, the maid entered with hesitating steps. Miss Ashford, she stammered. Miss Lydia Fairfax asks to see you. Eleanor looked up sharply, surprise knitting her brow. Lydia had once called herself a friend, if friendship could be defined by polite smiles and convenient companionship. Their connection had always been fragile, but never hostile. Eleanor hesitated before nodding. Please show her in. Lydia swept into the room moments later, her posture anxious, her expression arranged into concerned sympathy. Eleanor, my dear, she said, lowering her voice. I came the moment I heard. People are speaking so unkindly. I feared you might be distraught. Eleanor blinked, uncertain whether to welcome the gesture. It has been a difficult day, she admitted. Lydia exhaled dramatically and took her hands. I told them it was all ridiculous. The Duke paying you such attention, well, it is clearly a misunderstanding. The comment pricked Eleanor's pride, but she held her tongue. Lydia pressed on. Of course, everyone is repeating their own version of what happened. I tried to explain you did nothing to encourage the Duke, but people can twist anything, can't they? Something in Lydia's tone, too eager, too rehearsed, softened Eleanor's guard. She spoke honestly, quietly. I wish the gossip would stop. I never wanted this. I do not understand what the Duke intended, but I fear society will ruin my reputation over something I did not seek. Lydia's eyes gleamed with subtle satisfaction. Eleanor did not immediately recognize. Oh, I know. Poor thing, she murmured. I only hope the papers remain gentle. The column this morning was already unpleasant. However, Eleanor's breath hitched. The papers? Lydia's expression shifted, just enough to betray her true purpose. Oh, did you not hear? There is talk that you sought the Duke's attention deliberately, that you confided in certain friends that you hoped to catch his eye. Eleanor felt the floor tilt, her pulse quickening. I said no such thing. Lydia sighed with manufactured sadness. I told them as much. I defended you. But you know how the press is. The room seemed to grow colder as realization crept through Eleanor's mind. Lydia had come not to comfort her, but to gather details, to turn her vulnerability into fodder for others. Lydia, she said slowly, what have you told them? Lydia's smile faltered. Only the truth as I understood it. Hours later, long after Lydia departed, a new column appeared in the city's most vicious gossip paper, filled with twisted versions of Eleanor's words, cruel implications, and accusations that she had schemed to ensnare the Duke. The scandal spread with the force of an accusation too salacious to ignore, and in a single evening, Eleanor Ashford's name was dragged through London streets like a banner of shame. Across the city, when Alistair Ravenswood received the paper and read the lies printed in black ink, something inside him snapped with quiet, lethal fury. This time, he would not remain silent. Eleanor stared at the crumpled newspaper in her trembling hands, the ink smudged from where her fingers pressed too tightly against the page. Her name appeared in bold, merciless script, twisted into falsehoods, dressed in insinuations, made into something ugly and conniving. The article accused her of deliberately seeking the Duke's attention, of confiding secret aspirations to snare him, of scheming for influence she had never once desired. Each sentence felt like a blow. Each lie carved away another piece of the quiet life she had once known. She pressed the paper to the table and stepped back, struggling to steady her breath. Her mother rushed to her side, wringing a handkerchief between her fingers. Eleanor, do not read it again. It is filth, nothing but spite. But Eleanor sank slowly into a chair, her voice barely above a whisper. They believe this. They truly believe I am capable of something so manipulative. Her mother knelt beside her, trying to gather her trembling hands. People believe what is easiest for them, and this story is easy, cruel, but easy. Eleanor shook her head, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. I tried so hard to avoid attention. I tried so hard to be unremarkable. She paused, her throat tight. Now I am a scandal. Mrs. Ashford hesitated before speaking again. Your uncle in the countryside has written. He says you are welcome to stay with him as long as you need, until the gossip dies down. Eleanor looked up, startled. Leave London? Perhaps only for a short while, her mother said carefully. A week or two, long enough for people to move on to the next spectacle. It may be the only way to protect you. Eleanor swallowed hard. The idea of fleeing, of abandoning the life she knew, filled her with a mix of relief and shame. But she understood her mother's fear. A young woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily crushed and seldom restored. She stood slowly, her gaze drifting toward the small traveling trunk stored near the hall. If my presence only fuels the scandal, then perhaps it is for the best, she whispered. I do not wish to bring further harm to our name. Her mother embraced her tightly. You have done nothing wrong, she insisted. I will not let this ruin you. But Eleanor felt the weight of inevitability pressing against her. It already has, she murmured. Meanwhile, in Ravenswood House, Alistair Ravenswood stood in his study, the offending newspaper spread across his desk. The inked lies ignited a cold fury within him, an anger that simmered far deeper than his usual disdain for gossip. He recognized the malicious craftsmanship behind the words, lies designed with precision, accusations crafted to wound, and implications meant to shame Eleanor Ashford while shielding those who had orchestrated the attack. Lord Whitcomb entered the room cautiously, sensing the storm brewing. "You have read it, then?" Alistair did not look up. "Find the source." Whitcomb blinked. "Alistair, find the source." No. Even his advisor, who had known him since childhood, took a step back. "Very well," he said softly. "I will investigate at once." As Whitcomb left, the Duke gripped the edge of his desk with enough force to whiten his knuckles. The image of Eleanor, humiliated, exposed, pushed into a corner by the cruelty of those who envied her, seared his thoughts. He had been raised to handle conflict with precision, to measure every move, to guard his emotions like secrets of war. But now, emotion, real, unfiltered, unwelcome, flooded through him with alarming clarity. The world's lies had wounded Eleanor, and Alistair Ravenswood, the coldest man in England, discovered a truth he could no longer deny. He would not allow the world to break her. Alistair Ravenswood did not need long to uncover the truth. By midday, discreet inquiries placed into the hands of his most trusted staff revealed everything he had expected, and more. The lies in the gossip column traced back not to chance, not to rumor, but to deliberate malice. Lydia Fairfax had spoken to a reporter directly, offering confidences and supposed conversations with Eleanor, claims entirely fabricated. She had painted Eleanor as ambitious, manipulative, and foolish enough to believe the Duke might actually return her interest. Lydia had even implied that Eleanor had intended to use the Duke's intervention at the ball to elevate her social standing. The audacity of the betrayal struck Alistair with a force he rarely experienced. He felt anger, cold, sharp, and unyielding, flare beneath the calm exterior he fought to maintain. Whitcomb returned to the study in quiet triumph. "It is confirmed," he said. "Miss Fairfax visited the columnist last evening. She gave every detail they printed, and then some. I doubt she realized the story would spread so viciously." Alistair looked up slowly, the ice in his eyes outmatching the winter chill outside. "Miss Fairfax knew precisely what she intended," he said. Whitcomb hesitated. "What do you plan to do?" Alistair turned his gaze toward the window, jaw tight with resolve. "Act." His tone carried such quiet finality that Whitcomb did not press further. Within hours, the Duke's influence swept through London like a silent storm. The same gossip paper that had printed the salacious accusations received an anonymous but unmistakably threatening message: "Retract the lies, name your informant, or face consequences no publication wished to endure." Editors scrambled, terrified of crossing a man whose reputation for precision and ruthlessness was legendary. Meanwhile, Lydia Fairfax found her invitations mysteriously revoked. Nobles she had once charmed turned cold, offering brittle excuses or avoiding her entirely. One by one, her connections shifted away, guided by an invisible hand she could neither see nor fight. The Duke had not spoken publicly, he had not shouted or accused, but the quiet force of his displeasure rippled through society like a warning strike of thunder. But for Alistair, punishing Lydia was only the beginning. The more pressing matter weighed heavily on his thoughts. Eleanor was preparing to flee London. Whitcomb delivered the news with a resigned sigh. "It appears Miss Ashford plans to depart for her uncle's estate by evening. Her mother is packing her things. It seems the scandal has overwhelmed her." Alistair stilled, fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. "She intends to leave," he repeated softly, as though tasting the words. Whitcomb nodded. "Her mother believes it the safest course." Alistair closed the distance to the door in 2 long strides. "Prepare my carriage." "Alistair," Whitcomb began, caught between alarm and amusement, but the Duke had already left the room, the sound of decisive footsteps echoing through the halls. Guards scrambled to keep pace as he strode toward the entrance, shrugging on his cloak with movements edged in fury. He did not bother waiting for the footman to open the door before stepping outside. Snowflakes drifted through the air like fragile sparks as he mounted the carriage steps and ordered the driver to move with urgency that startled even the seasoned horses. As the carriage sped through the winter streets, Alistair braced his gloved hands against the seat, steeling himself against emotions he had spent a lifetime denying. He told himself he sought Eleanor only to correct injustice, only to keep her from being crushed by a world that delighted in cruelty. But beneath the rationalizations throbbed a deeper truth, one he could neither name nor bury. He could not let her disappear from his world. Not now, not like this. Eleanor's traveling trunk lay open on her bed, half filled with neatly folded dresses and the few sentimental possessions she treasured, small tokens of a life lived quietly, modestly, and without fanfare. Her hands trembled as she placed a worn book of poetry atop the stack. She tried to steady herself, but her breath refused to calm. Each passing moment made her decision feel more final, more irreversible. She had spent her entire life avoiding scandal, avoiding attention, avoiding the brutal scrutiny that society wielded like a weapon. Now she had become the center of a storm she never invited, and the only escape she could imagine was to leave before the world swallowed her entirely. Her mother fussed around the room with frantic energy, moving items back and forth, pausing only to issue anxious reminders. "We must not delay," Mrs. Ashford whispered. "Your uncle wrote that the roads remain passable. If we leave before nightfall, we can reach his estate by tomorrow afternoon." Eleanor nodded numbly, though the thought of leaving London, leaving everything familiar, twisted painfully inside her. Downstairs, the maid hurried to and from the foyer with a mix of urgency and sympathy, preparing the final necessities. Eleanor took one last look around her bedroom, trying to memorize the soft colors, the gentle comforts, the life she had built in the safety of quiet corners. She told herself she would return. She told herself this exile would be brief, but the fear that whispered beneath those reassurances felt far more honest. She did not know if her life here would ever return to what it had been. A sudden clatter echoed from outside, the unmistakable sound of wheels grinding to a halt on the cobblestone street. Eleanor turned sharply. Her mother paused mid-step, eyes widening. Who could that be? Before they could speculate, hurried footsteps approached the door, followed by urgent knocking. Eleanor's pulse leapt. Her mother rushed downstairs, and Eleanor followed, each step weighted with dread. When Mrs. Ashford opened the door, cold winter air spilled into the foyer, and the silhouette of the man standing beyond it sent a shock through Eleanor's entire being. Alistair Ravenswood filled the doorway with his formidable presence, snowflakes clinging to the shoulders of his dark coat, his breath visible in the cold. His eyes, those steely, unflinching eyes, locked onto Eleanor the moment she appeared on the stairs. Something inside her faltered. She gripped the railing to steady herself. Her mother stood frozen, unsure whether to curtsy or faint. "Your Grace," she managed. We were not expecting—" "I am here for Miss Ashford," the Duke said, his voice low and resonant, carrying a quiet intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. Eleanor's breath caught. She descended the remaining steps slowly, each one echoing through the silent room. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but the Duke stepped forward, closing the distance between them with a certainty that made the world feel impossibly small. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it, "do not leave London." She stared at him, stunned. "Your Grace, I must. You have seen the papers. You must know how they speak of me." "I do," he replied, an edge of anger sharpening his tone. "And I know the lies they printed, lies you do not deserve to bear." Eleanor swallowed hard. "But the longer I remain here, the more they will talk." "Let them talk," he said, stepping closer. "Let them speculate. Let them whisper. They will do so regardless of your actions." Eleanor shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. "But I cannot endure it, Your Grace. Not when the world believes I sought to entangle you." Alistair's gaze softened, not with pity, but with something deeper, something that made her heart tremble. "I will not allow them to ruin you," he said quietly. "I came because I could not let you disappear. Everyone." In that moment, in the stillness of her family's modest foyer, Eleanor realized the truth she had tried so hard to deny. The coldest man in England had crossed the city for her, and he had no intention of turning back. Eleanor stood motionless at the foot of the stairs, her pulse quickening as the Duke's presence filled the narrow foyer like a force of nature. Snow melted slowly along the edge of his cloak, but Alistair Ravenswood himself seemed untouched by the cold, carved instead from resolve, from purpose, from something fierce and unyielding she had never imagined directed at her. For a trembling moment, neither of them spoke. Her mother hovered beside her, wringing her hands silently, uncertain whether she was witnessing a disaster or a salvation. Eleanor felt as though the air itself waited for her next breath, At last, she forced herself to find words. "Your Grace, you should not be here. My departure is necessary. It will spare both of us further humiliation." Her voice cracked on the last syllable, but she refused to let her gaze fall. If she was to leave London in disgrace, she would at least leave with dignity. But the Duke stepped forward, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. "I disagree," he said quietly. "Your departure would spare no one. It would only serve the lies spoken by those who envy you." Eleanor's heart thudded painfully. "I am not enviable," she whispered. "You see something that is not there." The faintest crease appeared at the corner of his eyes, more emotion than she had ever seen from him. "I see more clearly than most," he replied, "and what I see in you is neither shame nor deceit. It is grace under cruelty. That is a rarity in our world." Eleanor felt tears sting but blinked them away, unwilling to let them fall. "It does not matter what you see," she said softly. "It matters what society chooses to believe, and they have chosen their story." Alistair's jaw tightened in controlled irritation. "Then they shall be corrected." "By whom?" Eleanor asked, her voice breaking. "By you. You owe me nothing, Your Grace, nothing at all." For a moment, something fierce flashed in his eyes, anger not at her, but at the injustice inflicted upon her. "On the contrary," he said, voice low and steady, "I owe you truth, and I owe you protection from a world that delights in tearing apart those who display a strength it cannot understand." Her breath caught. He took another step closer, and his presence enveloped her without touching her. It was overwhelming, frightening only because it felt so real. "Miss Ashford," he continued, "I did not intervene at the ball out of obligation, and I did not come to your home out of pity." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Then why?" His answer came slowly, as though torn from a place he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. "Because I could not remain silent while your reputation was destroyed for an act of kindness you never sought. Because I dislike injustice. Because your silence in the face of cruelty, your refusal to bend to it, has remained in my thoughts since the moment I saw you." He paused, letting the words settle between them. "And because I could not bear the thought of you leaving London believing yourself alone." Eleanor felt her knees weaken, her composure trembling beneath the weight of his confession. Her mother's hand gently steadied her shoulder. "Your Grace," she whispered nervously, "if you speak this sincerely, the world will hear it." Alistair turned to her mother, his expression unwavering. "It is time they did." He turned back to Eleanor, voice unwavering. "If rumors must exist, then let me be the one to shape them. I will accompany you to Lady Weatherly's ball this evening, publicly, without hesitation." Eleanor's breath hitched. "The ball? But You will not hide," he said simply. "Not when you have done nothing wrong, and not while I can still stand at your side." Eleanor stared at him, overwhelmed by the impossible turn her life had taken. A duke, this duke, offering not just defense, but open allegiance. Her mind reeled, her heart trembled, and yet one truth resonated through her with startling clarity. The coldest man in England had chosen to step into the fire for her, and he intended for the entire world to see it. Night fell quickly over London, casting the city in a cool indigo glow as lamps flickered to life along the streets. Eleanor stood before her small bedroom mirror, the soft lamplight illuminating her pale features as she tried to steady her trembling breath. Her mother fussed behind her, adjusting the fit of Eleanor's gown with nervous hands, but Eleanor barely heard the rustle of fabric. Her thoughts pulsed with a single overwhelming awareness. She would enter Lady Weatherly's ball not in obscurity, not in quiet endurance, but in the company of the Duke of Ravenswood himself. The notion felt impossible, like something borrowed from a dream she had never dared to imagine. Her reflection showed a woman unsure of her own place in the world, a woman who felt fragile under the weight of the scandal she carried. Yet beneath the uncertainty, a faint spark of something steadier flickered, a thread of courage she had not known she possessed until the Duke had spoken her name with conviction. She touched her gloved fingertips to her cheek, trying to ground herself. "Mother," she whispered shakily, "what if they laugh at me again? What if I embarrass him simply by being at his side?" "Mrs." Ashford placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "My darling, there are moments in life when one must choose whether to stand or to run. Tonight, you stand." Eleanor closed her eyes. She wished the words comforted her more than they frightened her. When the carriage arrived, The house seemed to still around the sound of hooves and wheels. Eleanor descended the stairs, her heart pounding as the door opened and winter air swept in. The Duke stood waiting, impeccably dressed and unmistakably resolute. Snow dusted his dark coat, melting slowly under the warmth of the entryway. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at him, at the man who had upended her fate with nothing more than a few spoken truths. He inclined his head politely. "Miss Ashford," she curtsied, though her knees trembled. "Your Grace." His gaze swept over her with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "Are you ready?" he asked. The question felt monumental. Eleanor swallowed. I will try to be." Alistair's expression softened, just barely. "Trying is unnecessary. You need only walk beside me." The carriage ride passed in tense, fragile silence. Eleanor sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her mind racing with every possible disaster waiting at Lady Weatherly's estate. The Duke, meanwhile, watched the passing shadows with a contained energy she felt more than she saw. She wondered if he regretted offering to accompany her, wondered if he felt any uncertainty at all. But when the carriage slowed to a stop before the glowing entrance of the grand estate, he looked at her with calm determination. "They may judge," he said quietly, "but they do not decide. Remember that." She nodded, though she felt anything but composed. When they stepped out onto the lantern-lit path, all conversation at the entrance faltered. Heads turned, fans stilled, couples paused mid-step. The sight of the coldest duke in England offering his hand to the woman society had mocked only days prior struck the gathering like a lightning bolt. Eleanor felt every heartbeat in the crowd, every whisper held behind gloved hands. She hesitated for only a second, just enough for doubt to flicker, before she placed her hand in his. The contact sealed the room's fate. A collective gasp rose into the night air. Inside the ballroom, the reaction was instantaneous. Chatter stopped. Music softened, and as the Duke guided Eleanor across the marble floor with unwavering composure, the entire world seemed to tilt, realign, and fall silent. But Eleanor's knees weakened beneath the pressure. Her chest tightened, her breathing shallowed, and the weight of so many eyes pressed against her like a crushing tide. The whispers began again, sharp, accusing, relentless. The room wavered, her vision blurred, and before she could speak, before she could steady herself, her body gave way. The last thing she felt was the Duke's strong hand catching her as the ballroom dissolved into darkness. Eleanor came back to herself slowly, as though rising from deep water. The muffled sounds of music and voices drifted somewhere beyond her awareness, distant and blurred. When she opened her eyes, lantern light flickered above her, and the cool night air brushed gently against her skin. She lay on a small stone bench in Lady Weatherly's private garden, tucked away from the noise of the ballroom, not alone, but watched over with an intensity that felt almost protective. Alistair Ravenswood stood near her, his tall frame cast in sharp lines by the moonlight as he kept silent guard. His posture was rigid, but his expression carried something she never expected to see in him: concern unguarded, raw, and unmistakable. "You fainted," he said quietly when he saw her eyes open. "The crowd, the pressure, it overwhelmed you." His voice held none of the icy command he used in society. Here, alone in the quiet, it was softer, grounded, almost human. Eleanor flushed with embarrassment, pushing herself up slowly. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I did not mean to cause a scene." The Duke took a step closer, his gaze steady. "You caused no scene. The fault lies with those who pushed you beyond endurance." Eleanor shook her head weakly. "They will mock me again. They will say I swooned for attention." His jaw tightened at the thought. Let them try. For a moment, neither spoke. Their breath mingled with the cold air, the garden surrounding them with a hush that felt strangely intimate. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm the frantic beat of her heart. "I should not have come tonight," she murmured. "I thought I could face them with dignity, but I was wrong." Alistair's voice deepened with conviction. "You came with courage, Miss Ashford. More courage than anyone inside those walls has shown." He paused, then added more quietly, "And you did not face them alone." She lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from the faint, rather from the overwhelming nearness of him. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she whispered. "You owe me nothing. Your reputation." She hesitated, unable to finish. Alistair stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she felt the warmth of his presence in the cold night. "My reputation," he said, "has survived far greater challenges than the truth of defending a woman who deserves far better treatment than she has received." Her breath caught. "But why me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The Duke held her gaze for a long moment, the moonlight glinting in his eyes. "Because your silence last night said more than their laughter. Because you endured cruelty with grace. Because you do not wear a mask as they do, and because I could not watch them break you." The words wrapped around her, sinking deep into the fragile places she tried so hard to hide. She looked away, shaken by the intensity of his honesty. But Alistair reached out, not touching her, but offering his hand near enough that she felt the invitation. "Walk with me," he murmured. "Only here, only for a moment." She hesitated, her heart trembling with fear and hope alike. But something in his expression, a rare vulnerability, a softness carved through frost, made her place her hand gently in his. They walked slowly through the quiet garden, lanterns flickering like low stars around them, and in the stillness, Eleanor realized that everything she had feared, mockery, shame, ruin, had led her to this moment of truth. The coldest duke in England was no longer hiding behind his walls, and she no longer wished to hide behind hers. The Duke and Eleanor walked in quiet steps through Lady Weatherly's garden, following a curved stone path dusted with winter frost. The lanterns cast warm circles of light across the hedges, making the night feel suspended between reality and dream. Eleanor held her hand carefully in his, not tightly, not with the boldness of lovers, but with a trembling trust that made every step feel momentous. Alistair's grip was steady, his touch gentle despite the power that always lived in his posture. He said nothing at first, letting the silence settle comfortably between them until they reached a sheltered alcove trimmed with ivy. There, he released her hand slowly, as though reluctant to do so, and turned to face her fully. "Miss Ashford," he said in a low, controlled voice, "I am aware that my presence in your life has brought you turmoil. I cannot deny that. But I did not anticipate that the consequences would fall so heavily upon you." Eleanor clasped her hands before her, trying to still the nervous flutter in her chest. "You are not responsible for society's cruelty," she murmured. "If anything, I fear I have become a burden to you." The Duke's brow tightened, his expression darkening in immediate rejection of her words. "You are not a burden," he said firmly. "What burdens me, what infuriates me, is the way society treats those who cannot fight back. It disgusts me that your dignity was used against you." Eleanor's breath trembled as she absorbed his words. No one had ever spoken of her with such fierce certainty. No one had ever cared to. She lifted her gaze to his, finding not coldness, but a restrained warmth pulsing beneath the surface, dangerous, fragile, and real. "I only wish to live quietly," she whispered, "to be unnoticed. I never imagined this." She gestured vaguely toward him, toward the world that had cleaved open beneath her feet. Alistair took a step closer, his voice soft but unmistakably resolute. "And yet you remained unbroken before them. That quiet strength of yours, society mistook it for timidity. They were wrong. You do not need my protection to stand tall." His words should have comforted her, but they also pierced her with an overwhelming mix of gratitude and fear. "Then why," she whispered, "do you continue to stand at my side?" A long silence followed, the kind that felt poised on the edge of revelation. The Duke exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his tone was stripped bare of pretense. "Because I am not accustomed to feeling anything at all," he admitted. "Yet since the moment I saw you endure their cruelty with dignity rather than rage or tears, I have felt compelled to understand you, to shield you, to walk beside you even when common sense demands distance." Eleanor's heart stilled. She did not trust herself to breathe. Alistair continued, his voice thicker now, weighted with honesty. He seldom allowed himself. "I have spent years avoiding attachments, but something in you challenges the coldness I have guarded for so long." He paused, letting the truth settle. "If there is a burden in this situation, Miss Ashford, it is mine, not yours." The soft night wrapped around them as Eleanor's eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. Before she could speak, a sudden burst of lively music drifted faintly from the ballroom, pulling them both back to the world awaiting their return. The Duke's jaw tightened. "They will be expecting us," he said gently. "And they will watch us." Eleanor hesitated, fear rising like a cold tide. "I am not ready," she confessed. "Not for their eyes." Alistair extended his hand once more. "You need only take my hand," he murmured. "The rest I will bear." Eleanor inhaled shakily, then placed her hand in his again. They stepped toward the glowing doorway together, the Duke's presence shielding her like a vow spoken without words. And as lantern light enveloped them once more, Eleanor realized something profound. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. The moment Eleanor re-entered the ballroom, her hand still resting lightly in the Duke's, she felt the atmosphere shift as sharply as a sudden change in weather. Music faltered, conversations dimmed. A wave of whispers surged like a current around them, though none dared rise above a murmur. Even Lady Weatherly, the hostess herself, paused mid-greeting as Eleanor and the Duke crossed the threshold together. The sight of them, his steadfast presence, her trembling courage, sent a shock through the room so palpable that Eleanor could almost feel it prickling against her skin. She forced herself to breathe evenly, reminding her trembling heart that she had chosen to return, that she had chosen to stand beside him. But knowing it did little to ease the weight of so many watchful eyes. Alistair's posture remained impeccably controlled, but Eleanor sensed the protective tension in his shoulders, the deliberate way he guided her through the crowd as though shielding her from invisible blows. "Do not look down," he murmured quietly. "They must see you walk with confidence." She lifted her gaze, just slightly, just enough, and was startled by what she saw in the eyes of some guests. Curiosity, yes, judgment, certainly, but also something she had never expected. Uncertainty, as though the Duke's public support of her forced them to question every assumption they had made about the quiet wallflower they once dismissed without thought. Lady Cassandra stood near a group of admirers, her gown shimmering under the chandeliers. Her expression, however, had lost its sheen. She watched Eleanor with a tightening jaw, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of shock and something far darker, jealousy sharpened by disbelief. Eleanor felt Cassandra's gaze like a blade, tracing the length of her spine, but for the first time, she did not shrink away. She allowed herself to stand just a little taller. Alistair noticed. A faint, approving glimmer passed across his features. They approached a quiet corner where a cluster of older guests conversed, their attention shifting the moment the pair drew near. Lord Penwick, a greying man known for his sharp tongue, cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he said pointedly, "quite the spectacle tonight." Alistair's expression chilled instantly. "Then refrain from adding to it," he replied. The bluntness left the older man speechless. A ripple of surprise moved through the listeners. Eleanor gulped softly, her cheeks warming, but the Duke continued with calm authority. "Miss Ashford will not be subjected to further gossip. I trust that is understood." The command, though spoken quietly, carried unmistakable weight. Eleanor felt a tremor in her chest. Not fear, but awe. She had spent a lifetime being overlooked, spoken over, dismissed, and doubted. And now this man, this cold, solitary, formidable man, had placed her dignity above the comfort of society itself. It moved her in ways she did not know how to articulate. But as the evening progressed, something unexpected happened, something that unfolded slowly, subtly, but with unmistakable clarity. People began to shift, whispers softened, gazes changed. Eleanor offered a polite smile to a woman who had once ignored her, and to her surprise, the woman dipped her head with genuine courtesy. A gentleman she barely knew greeted her with a respectful bow. Even Lady Weatherly approached her to inquire after her health, with a warmth Eleanor could not remember ever receiving. Confidence, real confidence, began to set anchor in Eleanor's chest. It was delicate, still trembling, but no longer entirely fragile. She did not cling to the Duke for support. She walked beside him with growing steadiness, her steps no longer swallowed by fear, and Alistair watched her transformation with quiet pride. He had not intended for this night to become a turning point, but as he observed her, no longer hiding, no longer shrinking, he realized something profound. Eleanor Ashford was not merely enduring this world, she was beginning to claim her place within it, and he found himself wanting to protect that spark more fiercely than anything he had ever guarded before. The ballroom slowly regained its rhythm, though nothing felt the same as before. Eleanor sensed the change as palpably as a shift in the wind, whispers softening, stares losing their cruelty, the current of mockery that once circled her, now thinning beneath the Duke's unmistakable public allegiance. Yet while the world adjusted to this new reality, Eleanor herself remained acutely aware of every breath, every step, every flicker of sensation running through her. She had never been the center of attention. She had never been the subject of admiration, envy, or scrutiny on such a scale, and now, walking beside the coldest man in England, she found herself at the heart of an unfolding story she barely understood. Alistair escorted her to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from the crush of curious guests. Candlelight gilded the edges of his dark coat, making him appear almost luminous against the polished marble floor. Eleanor tried to calm her racing pulse, but the awareness of his nearness, his steady breath, his protective stance, the slightest brush of his sleeve against her arm, made it difficult to think clearly. She lowered her gaze for a moment, gathering courage, then looked up to find him watching her with a steady intensity that made her breath catch. "Your Grace," she whispered, "you have done more than I ever could have asked, but I fear this will cost you, your reputation, your alliances." Her words dissolved under the weight of her own uncertainty. Alistair's expression tightened, not with regret, but with a quiet resolve that felt unshakable. "Whatever I lose," he said calmly, "is worth less to me than your dignity." Eleanor felt those words strike deeply, unsettling her composure. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why risk so much for someone of no consequence?" For the first time, a subtle, wounded flicker crossed the Duke's eyes, as though the idea that she saw herself as inconsequential disturbed him more than any insult society had ever thrown his way. He took a small step closer, his voice lowering. "You speak of yourself with an unfamiliar harshness, Miss Ashford. I do not share it." He paused, letting the truth settle between them. "You matter, perhaps more than you realize." Eleanor swallowed hard, unable to answer. She turned slightly toward the ballroom, where couples danced in elegant patterns beneath crystal chandeliers. Somewhere in the distance, a violin trembled on a high note, filling the air with a yearning melody that seemed to reflect the strange, impossible ache blooming within her. She felt the Duke watching her quietly, thoughtfully, as though debating something significant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made her heart falter. "I asked you to walk beside me tonight," he said slowly, "because I wish to show you that you are not alone. But there is another truth I must speak now, one I can no longer justify keeping to myself." Eleanor turned to him, her breath shallow. The Duke inhaled deeply, the faintest trace of uncertainty flickering through his controlled demeanor, an emotion he likely had not shown in years. "Eleanor," he said softly, "my feelings for you are no longer something I can dismiss." Her heartbeat stumbled. "I have tried," he continued, voice thickening. "I have tried to reason with myself, to retreat, to restore distance." His gaze locked onto hers with a quiet desperation that made her knees weaken. "But I cannot." Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet, not with fear, but with a dizzying rush of emotion she had kept locked away. She opened her lips to speak, to protest, to deny, but the words refused to come. Alistair Ravenswood took her hand gently, not possessively, not boldly, but with reverent care. "I ask for nothing in return," he murmured, "only that you hear the truth." Her breath trembled. "Your Grace, I—" Before she could form the words, the ballroom doors opened with a clatter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lady Weatherly herself hurried toward them, her expression alarmed. "Your Grace, Miss Ashford, please forgive the interruption," she said breathlessly, "but something has occurred, and I fear—" She hesitated, eyes darting nervously toward Eleanor. "I fear it concerns you both." Lady Weatherly's hurried words seemed to freeze the very air around them. Eleanor felt her breath catch, her pulse stuttering as a hush fell over the immediate circle of guests who had instinctively turned toward the commotion. Alistair's grip around her hand tightened, not enough to alarm, but enough to steady. His eyes sharpened, the soft vulnerability he had just revealed cooling instantly into a controlled alertness. "What has occurred?" he asked, his voice low and crisp, carrying the weight of command even in its quietest form. Lady Weatherly swallowed, glancing nervously between the Duke and Eleanor, as if debating how much truth she dared to reveal in public. "It may be better discussed in private, Your Grace," she whispered. Without hesitation, Alistair inclined his head and guided Eleanor away from the gathering, following Lady Weatherly through a side corridor illuminated by flickering wall sconces. The further they walked, the quieter the world became, until the muffled music of the ballroom faded entirely. Eleanor's heart beat wildly against her ribs. Each step felt heavier than the last. Alistair did not release her hand. His composure remained steady, but she sensed the tension coiling beneath his calm exterior, a silent fury waiting for direction. They entered a small, elegantly furnished antechamber, where the door closed softly behind them. Lady Weatherly turned with an expression torn between sympathy and distress. "Your Grace, Miss Ashford, I have received word that a new article is circulating this evening. It was delivered to certain guests as they arrived." Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her. "Another article?" she whispered. Lady Weatherly nodded gravely. "Worse than the first. It accuses Miss Ashford of manipulating last night's events. It implies she feigned distress to gain your attention. It even claims she collapsed tonight to further the illusion." A rush of heat surged to Eleanor's cheeks. Not anger, but humiliation so sharp it felt like a blow. "I fainted because—" "I know why you fainted," Alistair cut in, his voice hardening with a steel edge she had never heard from him before. "And so do many who witnessed the pressure directed at you." He turned to Lady Weatherly. "Who distributed these papers?" She hesitated. "I cannot confirm it, but several guests claimed they saw Miss Lydia Fairfax speaking briefly with a footman at the entrance." The Duke's expression darkened. "Miss Fairfax again." Eleanor felt her eyes sting. "This is my fault," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "I should not have come tonight. The more I try to face them, the deeper I sink." Alistair stepped in front of her, forcing her gaze to meet his. "Do not say that," he said sharply. "Do not let their lies become your truth." Eleanor blinked rapidly, struggling to breathe past the knot in her chest. "But look what has happened, what they think of me, what they think of you. They think what fears tell them to," he replied. "Weak minds cling to falsehoods when truth threatens their comfort." Lady Weatherly approached and rested a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm. "My dear, please understand. Most of the room already doubts the article. They saw the cruelty directed at you. They saw your collapse. Many believe it was stress, nothing more." Eleanor looked down, her voice cracking. "But enough of them believe the worst. Enough always will," Alistair said. "No matter who you are." He paused, and something shifted in his eyes, something fierce and unrestrained. "But I will not allow anyone to drag your name through the mud again, not while I still draw breath." Eleanor froze, struck by the intensity of his vow. Lady Weatherly bowed her head. "The ballroom awaits your return, Your Grace. But perhaps Miss Ashford should remain here a moment longer." Alistair turned to Eleanor, his voice gentling. "If you wish to leave, I will escort you. But if you choose to stay—" He extended his hand, palm open, steady as ever. "Then let us face them together." Note: Eleanor stared at his hand, at the promise it carried, at the risk it invited, at the strength it offered, and felt something powerful unfurl inside her chest. She placed her hand in his, and in that single motion she chose courage over fear and truth over shame. The ballroom fell into absolute stillness the moment Eleanor stepped back through the double doors, her hand resting with quiet certainty in the Duke's. It was not the dramatic kind of silence that demanded attention. Rather, it was the collective breath of an entire room, struggling to reconcile the truth of what they saw with the lies they had eagerly consumed. Every head turned. Fans paused mid-flutter. Conversations died half-formed on painted lips. Even the orchestra hesitated, bows hovering above strings, as though the musicians feared that one misplaced note might break the spell. Eleanor felt the weight of that silence press against her chest, but tonight she did not shrink beneath it. Her hand in Alistair's anchored her, not as a shield, not as a claim, but as a quiet vow. She lifted her chin, the faintest tremor running through her, but she held firm. She had walked into this battlefield before feeling alone and powerless. Now, she was no longer either of those things. The Duke walked beside her with measured, unhurried steps, his presence formidable but composed. His expression, carved with the same frost-bound control he always wore, carried something new beneath its surface, unyielding purpose. Anyone who looked closely enough could see it, and many did. The crowd parted instinctively, each guest stepping back as though brushing against him might awaken some dormant wrath. Yet the wrath was not for them. It was reserved for those who had tried to break the woman at his side. Lady Cassandra stood among a cluster of admirers, her face an uneasy mask of feigned composure. When Eleanor passed her, Cassandra's eyes flickered with something sharp, resentment mingled with disbelief. She opened her mouth, perhaps to issue a cutting remark or a feigned concern, but Alistair turned his head just slightly toward her. That one simple movement, a glance, nothing more, sent Cassandra's confidence crumbling. Her lips closed in silence. Eleanor registered the shift with a mixture of awe and sorrow. It pained her that cruelty had shaped so much of her life. Yet standing here, with the Duke of Ravenswood refusing to yield an inch of ground on her behalf, she realized something she had never allowed herself to consider. She was not the weak one. Those who mocked her were. As they approached the center of the ballroom, Alistair stopped, turning toward her with the faintest incline of his head. A hush fell deeper still. He raised their joined hands slightly, not a theatrical gesture, nor a claim of ownership, but a declaration of truth that no rumor could distort. "Miss Ashford," he said quietly yet clearly, "if you wish to leave this event, say the word. I will take you from here at once, but if you choose to stay, know that I stand with you." The crowd leaned in, some in horror, some in envy, some with genuine fascination. Eleanor met his gaze, and her answer came not from fear, but from the courage that had been quietly growing in her chest since the moment he first crossed a ballroom for her. "I will stay," she whispered. A ripple of shock moved through the room, but Alistair's expression softened by a fraction, so small a change, yet so meaningful. He released her hand, only to offer his arm properly this time, and she took it without hesitation. The orchestra, sensing a cue it had not been given but somehow understood, resumed its melody. The Duke guided Eleanor into the first steps of a slow, graceful waltz, and the sight of them, his severity melting into rare tenderness, her quiet strength blooming into confidence, silenced every lingering whisper. In that moment, Eleanor realized something powerful and irrevocable. The world might still speak against her, but she had chosen not to run, and the Duke of Ravenswood had chosen not to let her fall. The waltz unfolded slowly, each movement a careful intertwining of breath, heartbeat, and unspoken truth. Eleanor felt the Duke's hand firm and steady at her back, guiding her with a confidence that eased the trembling in her limbs. She had never danced with a man of such precision, such presence, such quiet intensity. His every step matched hers as if he had known her rhythm all along, as if this dance had been waiting for them far longer than either dared admit. The chandeliers glimmered overhead, their warm light casting soft gold across his features, softening the edges of a man known for his frost, revealing something gentler beneath. For the first time, Eleanor saw not the Duke of Ravenswood, the feared aristocrat, the untouchable figure of cold authority, but simply Alistair, and the realization unraveled something deep inside her. Around them, guests stood frozen, as if witnessing a moment they would recount for years to come. But Eleanor no longer felt their eyes dragging against her skin. Her world narrowed to the warmth of Alistair's hand, the subtle tightening of his fingers when she faltered, the sound of his breath sinking with hers as though steadying her heartbeat through sheer will alone. When the music slowed to its final measure, her steps hesitated, less from exhaustion than from a fear that this fragile, brilliant moment might vanish. The instant the dance ended, the final note lingered in the air. Alistair's hand remained at her back a moment longer than propriety allowed, as if reluctant to sever the connection. He lowered his head, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "Eleanor, you have faced cruelty with more courage than any person I have known." She felt her throat tighten, overwhelmed by emotion. "I only did what I had to," she whispered. "I simply endured." He met her gaze with a deep, steady warmth. "No, you rose, you stood, you fought back, not with anger, but with dignity, and you have changed me more than you realize." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "Changed you?" He nodded once, his expression softened in a way she could scarcely comprehend. "I thought myself immune to feeling. I believed the world had carved the softness from me long ago. But you—" He paused, as if searching for words he rarely allowed himself to speak. "You have reminded me that there is more worth fighting for than reputation or power." As I. Her cheeks warmed, her pulse fluttering. "Alistair," she whispered, his name tasting unfamiliar yet impossibly right on her tongue. The sound of it made something flicker behind his composed exterior, something dangerously close to longing. "Eleanor," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice to a vow meant only for her. "What I feel for you is not rumor, nor obligation, nor misguided impulse. It is real, and I will not hide it, not from society, not from the world, and certainly not from you." Eleanor's breath trembled, but her voice did not falter. "Then let the world watch," she murmured. "I am no longer afraid." For a long, breathtaking moment, they simply stood there, two souls who had been strangers only days before, now bound by something undeniable. The music resumed softly in the background, but neither of them moved. Instead, Alistair lifted her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, sealing a promise the world could not twist or tarnish. Around them, whispers rose again, not cruel this time, but awed, shifting, reshaping the story London had once told about the quiet Wallflower and the coldest duke in England. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt not overlooked, not ridiculed, not dismissed, but chosen, seen, cherished. The ballroom glowed with lantern light. The world seemed to still its breath. And as Eleanor met Alistair's steady, unwavering gaze, she knew with absolute certainty this was not the end of her story. It was only its beginning.